Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on global bioethics and the threat of ideological colonization. Our guests are Father Shannon Bouquet, the president of Human Life International, an organization that trains local leaders around the world on issues related to life in the family, and Dr. Cynthia Jones-Nosacek, a family physician and bioethicist who recently returned from Uganda, where she assisted the Marquette Institute of Natural Family Planning in setting up a teacher training program with the Ugandan Catholic Medical Bureau. I'm your moderator, Phil Cerrone, an associate ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Global bioethics, developed in response to issues like pandemics and vanishing biodiversity that originate in one area of the world but affect many regions, or that disproportionately affect some areas but require a global response. A pillar of global bioethics evaluates how priorities set in one part of the world shape other geographic areas through the social, environmental, and political aspects of globalization. Consequently, equitable global development requires a broader moral perspective that is informed by the principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and the common good. Opposed to this model of holistic growth is the reality of ideological colonization. Writing in Crux magazine, Inez San Martin defines ideological colonization as, quote, a form of oppression of developing societies by affluent ones, especially the West, through imposing an alien worldview or set of values on plural societies, often by making adoption of those values a condition of humanitarian or development aid, end quote. Unfortunately, this trend is evident in many of the activities of governmental and international foundations. Father Bouquet will begin our discussion by describing some of the ways that he has witnessed foreign aid organizations imposing a Western mindset on local development, especially in Africa. He also will share an alternative grassroots approach that he believes better respects local partners despite often having fewer material resources to provide. Next, Dr. Jones-Nosacek will share some of her experiences working in Uganda, and she will also describe how an important part of resolving this conflict between foreign and local perspectives can be found by balancing three aspects of foreign aid, namely community, autonomy, and Western values. Father Bouquet and Dr. Jones-Nosacek, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
And Father, I think that we'll start with you.
Oh, very good. Well, again, thank you, Philip, for the opportunity to join in this webinar. It's a very important subject, that so many times people here in the United States and in parts of Europe really don't take enough time to consider the impact of foundations, governmental agencies, policies, procedures, the way that we approach, serving human persons around the world. And so it's, having served now HLI for 12 years, I have myself traveled to 90 countries. And so having seen with my own eyes, the impact both from a positive perspective in the sense of how various organizations, agencies, foundations can serve the good of humanity and work within a moral framework that respects human persons and human dignity. And I've also seen where many cases it does not, and the consequences of those actions reverberate not only to the immediate family that is impacted, but to society and to the common good. So I just want to start by, I sat down with Dr. Brian Close, who's been with HLI for over 27 years as an engineer, works in statistics, and really keeps track of many of the global agencies that are working, particularly in the developing world, specifically in Africa. And Brian has put together a portfolio of over 3,000 groups that are working in Africa alone. And whether it be some who dabble a little bit in population control to those that are fully committed to the cause. And so we encountered these groups in different ways in different countries. But I sat down with Dr. Bryan and we put together some numbers, and it might be good just to kind of look at this. Is some of the population control. I'm gonna put a little paper to my left here, so that I'm gazing down at. Since 1991 to 2022, about $190 billion has been spent, in population control. And I'm going to just use some of the numbers, make it more specific. In Africa, 127 billion since 1991. Now, these are tracking, those agencies that we can look at their 990. So obviously coming from the US, we're tracking, through the documentation, whether it be foundations or governmental agencies. By governmental agencies, I'm referring specifically to the United Nations, to USAID, to the UN's organizations or agencies or sub-agencies like UNICEF, or we're dealing with the United Nations Population Fund, and a litany of others. And so what we know is that these groups are tirelessly working on the ground to advocate for contraception, for abortion, what we call reproductive technologies. We see it aimed at particular countries where the birth rate is much higher, but we also see it in countries where the birth rate is already extremely low. And so we know that there are other motivations behind these agendas as they work in particular countries. This would deal with more of natural resources, access to those resources, but also, as you quoted, Philip, earlier, an ideological colonization. So we're no longer colonizing countries by the use of weaponry and extreme power in the sense, but using pharmaceuticals and various other mechanisms to colonize people's minds and approach the issues that are real in the developing world that affect poverty, affect human flourishing, affect the ethical questions and dilemmas that our brothers and sisters face every day in the developing world. So I start with that so that we have an idea. So like in Asia, about 40 billion since 1991. So just kind of think of those numbers. And for those that are listening, one thing that I see in my travel around, particularly in the developing world, is the assault on the family, and how the mindset, that the belief that the way that we're going to resolve poverty is by decreasing the population and by making larger families into smaller families. But in reality, this does not resolve the underlying issues that are causing poverty. And a quote from Emil Hagamu, our director in Dar es Salaam, but also the director for all of our work in English-speaking Africa, says we don't need contraception, we don't need abortion, we don't need these reproductive technologies. What we need is clean drinking water, infrastructure, health care, access to good education, mechanization, farming, electrification. What we need are those assistance with the infrastructure, then allow the principle of subsidiarity to come to bear and empowering the local people to be able to have the resources and skills that they need to be able to develop and to grow in their own community and support each other. But what we have is a very Western mindset of imposing foreign values. An example of that in Africa, where family is very important. The importance of welcoming children is something very much a part of African culture across the continent. And of course, there are examples of difficulties there that we can all know from human history. But mostly, the desire to live family life, to support family life, to have a great ethic of value of family, to work within the family is very important to especially here as I'm referring to here in Africa. And so when you have these foreign values come in, and as they're dealing with such difficult situations, it seems very alluring to receive these things. And we also know that, because I've seen and also experienced in different countries, Namibia, for example, I remember in a village about 9 hours out of the capital of Windhoek, they're working in the Rundu area near the Okavango River in Delta Valley, that the people would be, we would encounter these agencies, non-governmental organizations, and they were offering various assistance but only when they would attend courses, classes, workshops that would introduce them to contraception, provide contraception, whether they be oral, whether they be implant. So these are the things, same thing I've seen in other countries where malaria nets are important and necessary. And the way that they are able to distribute them is they require them to go through various workshops and so forth. And same thing with clean water wells, that is so necessary. Numbers range that over 30% or near 30% of Africans have no access to clean drinking water. I would say the same thing in parts of Asia, in parts of even in the Philippines, for example. So these are real issues, and they're very alluring. But the values that are being introduced to people really contradict their own core values. And so we see this especially in the major cities, where the universities have influence upon our young people and their mindset and framework. So these are very real situations that are unfolding, and the money and the infrastructure is very that's being offered to them is very alluring. An example of that in Kenya, there is a British aid was offering support for education, but having done a tremendous amount of work on that agency and knowing exactly what they're producing and promulgating in the developing world, i.e. reproductive technologies or reproductive services, so with contraception, abortion, the sterilization and so forth, that I was meeting with local parliament leaders as well as church leaders and saying, do you understand what this group does? And they said to me, we do, but we're keeping a close eye on them. Well, that no one can watch everyone, every moment, everywhere, in every situation. What we have seen is an introduction of foreign values that now have been introduced into the culture. And so these are very dangerous. And sadly, once these elements enter in, it's very difficult, Philip, and to get out. Very difficult to get the mindset out. An example in Uganda, near Entebbe, we had a gathering of local women who were struggling with health, and we were able to pull them together and to try to understand what it was that they were dealing with. And what we found was many of these women were taking multiple contraceptives. They were taking oral contraception, they had injectables. And what was happening is that people, particularly men, were hired by various pharmaceutical companies and organizations to go around and to get as many women as they could on a contraception. And they were offered incentive, meaning money. And so they really could care less how many a woman was introduced to various farms. The main thing is how many could they distribute. And health of these women was so dire that many of them could no longer eat, they could barely walk. And so the suffering of so many of our sisters in these situations. But these are just but a few examples. But it's important to, during the Trump administration, I remember sitting down with some of the administration discussing the UN and its various agencies, as I already mentioned, working in the developing world. And the response that I always received was it's very difficult to untentacle these groups. They're so entrenched in the amount of money that's being spent. I mean, think about it. When you look at the United Nations with over a $75 billion budget, and then I look at people like HLI or apostles like HLI and others that have such a small budget, we're working against a major Goliath. And that's why what's important is, to help the local leaders understand the various groups that are working or trying to work in their communities and help them realize who they are, what they offer, what they're doing, and help them not to allow these groups in. And so, and with that is the model that really does work within the Catholic Church, and that is the two principles that you mentioned earlier, Philip, and that is the principle of subsidiarity and solidarity. And what we've seen and how we try to work as well is how to empower local leaders, how to provide the skills and resources that they need in order for their own flourishing, and then to be able to help each other. An example of that would be like in farming. how to produce, a healthy crop. Now, that's not something HLI works with specifically, but we know we have a number of groups working in that cause. So supporting the local people, empowering local people, providing them the resources they need, education, physical, temporal resources, in order to provide for their own people and to have a healthier, family life. Healthier families produce a healthier society, and the common good thrives in that community. So I think that's a real challenge, that is before us. Pope Benedict XVI talked about this so often, in lamenting how these foreign agencies, impose foreign values, but instead of respecting those local values. And I think it's important, that as we move forward, and that's why we've taken a strong effort to identify the groups, and again, exposing local leaders to them so that they can make an informed decision about who they want to work with. Obviously, I have no power to tell people what to do and how to do, but I can at least educate and provide them formation in this regard, and then also introduce more positive ways of approaching. I think the challenge really is there's such a need. It all depends on the country that we're in. So like I said, when you mention Namibia and you get outside of the capital, there is such a need in these communities. They have very little resource to be able to make money in selling goods to provide for themselves. So they depend on each other and to help each other. So there's a different need. You get into other parts of Africa where you get into the rural communities. The need is very different. And you're realizing that, that access to clean water is very, very little, proper hygiene, sanitation, the road structures are very poor. Getting from one village to the next is very difficult. And so when these big groups come in and they offer, to pave their roads and build their bridges and to provide, I've seen groups like Coca-Cola and other distributors are the instruments used to bring contraceptives into the rural villages. I've seen where agencies come in, either sponsored by USAID, other UN agencies, or other countries in their foreign aid. Just coming in all their beautiful, nice, SUVs and large vehicles, and they're offering all these promises, but it comes with a cost. And this is where the real challenge is in the bioethics, is how to support the family, how to provide the means for the family to flourish, how to help individuals who are dealing with very real situations, poor health care, poor dental care, a lack of health care itself. When you think about the very fact that, I don't know in our audience who's with us today, but if most of us are here from the States, I mean, we don't think about if we were sick to get to an urgent care or to get to a hospital. It's within a reasonable amount of time. But in many parts of the developing world, it might be 100 kilometers, between them and the next hospital. And so healthcare is very important to them, and there's a great need. And how many women, who are with child, who are pregnant, have little access or no access to healthcare during their pregnancy, before their pregnancy, after. Children, don't have access, to pediatricians for their health care. I mean, there's a great need. And so when these groups come in promising the moon, it's a very alluring, and then all of a sudden it's the after effect. It's the consequences that they're not told about. And once they're in, it's done. And so we see this with regard to a decreasing in birth rates. So the mentality has been successful in creeping in and impacting. We've seen an increase, and bishops will tell me, priests will tell me, religious sisters working in the rural communities, that once the contraceptive mentality enters, they're seeing difficulties in family life, very difficult situations affecting marriages. We're also seeing an increase especially in the issues of increased sexually transmitted diseases. So there are so many things that come, with this. And I'll tell you, one bishop down in South Africa told me, he said he really wishes the internet was never allowed into Africa. As much as he appreciates the access, he says what comes with it is also so many other things that many of our African brothers and sisters are just not prepared to deal with. Issues of pornography that enter in, and so forth and so on. So it's a real challenge when we talk about the issue of ethical dilemmas facing our brothers and sisters. But I think what you're doing today, Philip, by bringing us together to talk about some of this, it's important for more people to get involved, to realize what's happening, especially here in the States, because of our support of the United Nations, the funding that we give to the United Nations really does impact the global conversation. It does affect families around the world. It affects how families receive aid. And so we should have a more active understanding of what's being done, and then speak, to the ill things, because not everything is bad. Not every program is bad, but there are many things that are, and we need to be aware of them and voice our concern about them. The other thing we need to do is look at ways that maybe we can help even more. I know Dr. Cindy is going to talk about this. I've seen such a great need for doctors to travel, to developing world, to provide care. I work with a couple of medical groups in going into other territories of the world to provide dental care, eye care. These are such a need. So we need more people to become actively involved. And the third thing I would say, Philip, and that is in the last minute here, is the importance of respecting, local people and not overstepping our own bounds. What I mean by that is, I'll just use myself and HLI. When we go into a community, it's always by invitation. And we respect the local people and try to find a way to help them to be able to meet their own need, to look at ways to support them, introduce maybe other things that are available that we can offer and others can offer, to really respect, their own understanding, their own culture, their own traditions, their own customs, and to be able to help them in that. So I think that's very, very important. So that's what I wanted to share today, and I look forward to maybe some of the questions. But I know that the last thing I would say is there is such a hunger, within the developing world for support, and I really believe, and I've seen it with my own eyes, when we invest in an authentic human flourishing, respecting human persons, respecting human dignity, supporting the family and assisting families, they really flourish. They blossom. As one archbishop said in closing, he said, what we need is, in a sense, of assistance to rise, but let us do the rising. Let us do the movement. Help us to get there, but don't overtake, don't impose, and don't try to supplant. And I thought that was a very good insight by the Archbishop.
Thank you very much, Father Bouquet. That was, a very, insightful look into kind of what's going on, on the ground with those international organizations. Next, we have Dr. Jones Noschek, who's going to again share some of her experiences working overseas, as well as some of her reflections on ways to address this problem. Dr. Jones?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think, when I don't represent a big group, so mine are more personal observations. I work with a committee that's with our church. We call it Global Solidarity, where we have a committee here in the United States, and then another committee in a town in northern Uganda called Padibe, and that we work with together. My other relationship with Uganda is with the Marquette Institute of Natural Family Planning, where we're presently trying to set up a training program in natural family planning. And so this, from these experiences, is how I've been able to see some of the paternalism that we can experience when the Western countries come in. Realize when we first started with bioethics, it was a reaction to the paternalism of the physician. that the physician always knew best and ignored the fact that sometimes the patient knows what's best for themselves. And I see that with global bioethics. Global bioethics, it's a reaction against the paternalism of the rich Western countries coming in and saying, this is the way it's supposed to be. For example, natural family planning, even though it has a lot of science behind it, the World Health Organization has decided to ignore the science and consider it a traditional method of family planning, which therefore means it doesn't get support or funding or bonuses, whereas condoms and hormonal contraceptives, sterilization, etc., those are modern methods, and those are the ones that get the support. If you go to a lot of these rural government clinics, the nicest office in the clinic and the nicest dressed nurse in the clinic is the one that's provided the contraceptives. So it is a problem, and yet people want natural methods of family planning. They don't like the side effects that they have. When I talk to nurses out in the rural clinics, they say they have trouble keeping up with the demand for things, for simple methods, such as the cycle beads from Georgetown, the standard days method. The director of the government hospital told me that there's a demand for natural methods of family planning, but no one has been trained to offer it. So the requests are there, but they're being ignored because that's not considered a modern method. In our committee also, we have people that come in with their own ideas as to what should be the proper behavior. So for example, there was someone who felt that the men should be helping with the cooking. Men should learn how to cook and they should be cooking some of the meals. And isn't this terrible that the women do all the cooking? And she'd go on and on and on and on about this. And finally, the priest took her aside and he says, in a marriage, cooking is one of the few ways that a woman has control over the relationship. And if you take that away from her, what does she have left? Well, that wasn't good enough. And she still insisted that men had to learn to cook, but she didn't want to think about the consequences, or that maybe there were other ways that men could help women around the house with some of the burdens that they have to do with caring for the children and they call them gardens, the fields, the house, all of that, without necessarily taking over the cooking. In Uganda, I was told, white people don't walk. White people come in, they drive their big SUVs, they talk to the important people, tell them what's supposed to be done, and they leave. And whereas in the people that I talk to, they say, the projects are nice, the projects are important, but what is just as important is that relationship, that we work together in a relationship. So what we do with our global solidarity is that, my husband and I, we go into town, other people we go to Badibe, and, we go to the various groups, and the various groups will tell us all their needs, but then the committee there makes a decision as to what other projects to present to us for our funding. And then we decide based on the funding we have, what we can afford to support. So it's a collaborative agreement. We respect, the fact that it's the elders who are the important ones in this community. And ultimately that's where things come in. We come in with our expertise, the community has their expertise, and ultimately too, it's for to allow for the flourishing of the individuals. And that's why I talk about there is that tension between autonomy and the community, and then what we can bring as well. And all of us are experts in our various fields, but yet we have to respect the dignity of each other, or we just can't go in and impose what we want to do. Our committee is very looking into things to help the community to sustain itself. So we support the growing of cassava. We have helped them to build a sunflower press so that now people can have income so they can send their children to school. From the sunflower press, the people themselves took that sunflower press, and from there, they now have a bank in town, so people don't have to go 30 minutes away to pay school fees, etc. They have a welding business, so to make beds, etc. for the village. They found that the leftovers from the press are good animal feed, so they sell that. And and so they've now expanded what we've given them and flourished beyond what we even thought was possible. We support education for the children so that the children can go on and get jobs, or if they decide to stay home and care for the gardens, how to do that in a way so that they can best improve their livelihoods. We've supported the medical clinic there for the same reason. It's one of the best clinics in the district, even though it loses points because it doesn't provide contraception. So, it's one of those clinics, it's open 24/7, whereas the government clinic is 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And so if a woman goes into labor on the weekend, she goes to the Saints Peter and Paul Clinic in Pedive, because there may not be somebody there to help her to deliver at the government clinic. And so people will walk past the government clinic if they can afford it to go to this clinic, because they know they will be treated as persons and not as a disease, and not as, just come in, get out, we're done with you. So it's a way that I think that we need to look at how we deal with each other, and that we're talking about not the greater good, which means, how well is the public doing, but the common good, which means we are setting up an environment to allow the flourishing of every person, every individual, because when we take our eyes off the individual, that's when we start getting into trouble. That's when we start saying, and when we deny the dignity of the person, that's when we start imposing our will on other people. And so again, it's really about the relationship. And even though we may not have the same kind of funding that the World Health Organization, et cetera, has, the fact that we're willing to enter into relationship, I think will go a long way in the future in terms of building a culture that allows for the flourishing of the common good.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I appreciate that. Any other thoughts from either of you before we take some questions? All right, just a reminder to everybody who is listening, we're going to start the questions now. We've got plenty of time, so please send in any questions that you have. We have a wealth of knowledge here with our two guests, and we'll see where this question and answer session takes us. This first question is for both of you. It's, what do these organizations gain by reducing the population?
Well, I mean, so what do these organizations gain, by decreasing the population? It's a very common question. And the one thing that, we have seen, again, Dr. Brian Close, has been following, for all these many years, the ways these organizations work. And what we've seen is the access to the natural resources. So when you start looking at the Western world, and its desire to continue to operate in its own way. So when you think of the way that the Western world lives, how do we maintain that lifestyle? And so we need resources. And so in many cases, those resources are not natural to the United States, or natural to various countries of Europe, Japan, or Australia, New Zealand, and many other so-called Western worlds, nations. So we look to the other parts of the world, and to be able to access these resources. And much of that, especially when it comes to define metals and particular that we need for different industries, Africa is a prime resource. And so by decreasing the population and decreasing the need they will have toward their natural resources, then we can have access to them. And we can do that by, negotiating. I'm going to give you an example. I'll make reference to one country particularly. So, because I just heard this just recently while in Portugal. So when a country like China negotiates to enter into a new country by offering economic support, it will say, okay, fine, we will come into the country, we will provide all the infrastructure to build a new seaport for you, and we will sign an agreement for 99 years. And in those 99 years that you will not charge us taxes, we will pay no taxes for this. We will then be able to benefit from that. And if there's a breach in any way, then it's always to the benefit of the one providing the economic resource. I've seen that play out not just with China, but other countries in the developing world that are coming in. So that's one way of responding to that question. Also the issue in the pharmaceutical, we have a chart of how many major pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, for example, that are actually working in parts of Africa to acquire the resources they need, the natural resources they need to produce their drugs and so forth and so on. So that's what we've seen.
Yeah, I think too, there's just a disdain towards large families and towards families in general. And if places like Africa or Asia who support families, who have large families, are able to succeed and do that, that says something against against us. And so, we don't want them to succeed with a large family. We don't want them to have large families because it's an indictment against, our values.
And if I could just add to that, with that disdain, really there is an issue of discrimination. There are racial issues. I mean, especially when you consider, that if a larger population is growing in Africa, then we also see immigrants moving from these countries into Europe, into the United States, and so forth. So there is that element as well. So I think that disdain for the family, also kind of moves into the way that people look at certain ethnic groups and are concerned about, quote unquote, a certain color, a brown skin or a black skin population growing.
Thank you both very much. The second question, it focuses, I think, more explicitly on some things that Father Bouquet brought up, but I think both of you will have some excellent insights on it. You had mentioned manipulative practices and quid pro quo for aid. More specifically, what are the kinds of things that are promised, and how does this arrangement affect rural communities, especially? And then also a follow-up question to that. Do Catholic organizations have a similar quid pro quo regarding aid in exchange for exposure to Catholic values?
Dr. Jones, you want to start with that one, or you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said before, especially with the government clinics, the nicest room in the building is the one that provides the contraceptives. And so, that it does seep into the culture. When I was there last February, some aid organizations came into town and they wine and dined the healthcare leaders of the community and were telling them how to talk to women about how to decrease your number of children you have. It wasn't how can families discern the number of children that they can afford or emotionally support, etc. It was, what's important is making sure these women don't have as many babies as they're having. And so I see that coming in, especially in the rural areas where they have so little. you know, and it is hard just to make do from day to day. At the clinic where I've gone to, there have been times when the healthcare workers haven't been paid for months because they just don't have the money. And yet they come in and work, as I said, 24/7 to provide care for the community, even though they're not getting paid to do it.
Yeah, and if I, add just a little bit to this in a sense of, so what, what's the benefit in a sense to quid pro pro? What happens here, with this? An example would be, so I'll use the clinic that Dr. Jones is talking about. So, if a doctor is willing to cooperate with an agency, the WHO, the USAID, British Aid, whatever it may be, then the benefit is that they do get the nicer clinic, they get the nicer equipment, they get the better facility, which becomes really, in all honesty, if each of us here, if we had two clinics to choose from, one is filthy, unkept, one that's perfectly clean, and the grass is well manicured, the doctor is well dressed, the nurses are well dressed, which one we're going to head toward? Then obviously we're going to head toward the one that's cleaner, and so forth and so on. Also, think about this is, in many times these clinics are, quote, giving free pharmaceuticals. And so, because they're receiving them for free, but it's a way of, if I may say a word, which is not a very maybe a more proper word, but it's a pimping. In other words, once we get people on these particular drugs or on this particular relationship and dependent, then they can continue to build on that, and then start having greater access. So that's one thing I've seen. Another thing I've seen is working with the local leaders in a given community. So because they have the greater influence on the larger community. So if the local leadership enters into a partnership, a collaborative relationship, let's say for clean water wells, well, what happens is what they will do is put a quota. So if you get so many families, and particularly women, to come to these seminars, to come to these workshops, if you get so many husbands and wives or people who are cohabitating to come to a workshop on reproductive technology and reproductive services, then we will provide you 2 water wells in your community. We'll provide you 50 malaria nets. And so what you're seeing is the use of these needs. I mean, there is such a need. It's hard for us here in the West to appreciate the need for a malaria net. Something so simple that, that's so it doesn't cost a lot of money to produce, but to people in the developing world where that resource is very lacking, that net is valuable to them, or to have access to clean water. I mean, again, we take it so for granted here. How many of us run, the tap, for us men, shaving our faces and never turn the water off? We just let it run. All right. And none of us really walk to our tap and wonder, is it clean? But yet that's the problem. So these are some of the ways. Farming equipment, for example, if you own an example of this was told to me last year while visiting in a country in Asia. They located oil in their country for the first time. They've never knew they even had this valuable resource. And so they learned they had it. They have no mechanization, no technology, and the ability to pull that resource from the ground. So who do you think comes in? Is the Western world. And they come in and say, we will draw the oil from the ground for you, and so forth, and we'll give you a percentage of it. Well, first of all, at least the leaders of that country realized that this was such a value, and they said to them, no, we're not doing that. We will wait until we can learn ourselves how to draw it, because this is for our people, this is for our own country. And yet these other groups wanted to take it and exploit the situation. So those are just but a couple of examples. There are a litany of examples I know both of us could provide in what we've seen.
All right, the next question is, has the introduction of contraceptives into Africa affected families there differently than it affected families in Western countries when it was introduced, primarily during the 20th century.
I'll let Dr. Jones, if you let you start it, because you're seeing that from the clinic side of quite a
Yeah,
bit. Yeah.
you know, I think a lot of times, they introduce contraception because, they say in part, women don't have power in the relationship and therefore, they can, this way they won't get pregnant. But, even if you give them a contraceptive, that doesn't change the power differential. That doesn't change the possibility that the woman will be abused because she asks her husband or her partner for money so that the children can pay their school fees. And so it's brought in, just to reduce the number of children, but it doesn't solve some of the problems, and the same problems that that we have had. I think, as I haven't seen it yet because, I think in Uganda, I'm trying to remember, there was less than half of the population is contracepting. So I don't think it has had the same effect on their culture that it has had on us, where 95% of our of the women are on some form of contraceptive. And so, but it's getting there. And again, it's the idea that, you know, you're having too many children. Not that how many children can you support, how many children can you emotionally handle. You need to think about what we call responsible parenthood. It's, if you have more than two, that's too many. Forgetting the fact that many of these women have lost children. I, you know, as a mother, I have 5 kids, as mothers everywhere, we talk when I go there, we talk about it, and I say, yeah, I have my 5 kids, and I tell them my girls and my boys. And every mother I've talked to says, I have this many children, and then gives me the number that died, at least 1 or 2. Malaria kills them, the lack of clean water kills them, and yet we just want them to have fewer children, and not concerned about making sure that these children survive.
And if I could with that as well, is so that the idea, understanding is, the mindset of contraception and its use and its in the Western world in relation to the developing world. The one thing is, if you look to Europe and and you realize that the total fertility rate of all of Europe is at 1.5. So when you start realizing that Europe itself is in, like the United States is at 1.63. You look at China at 1.635. You look at various parts of the world, and you're realizing the rejection that the world is having toward welcoming children, the disdain, as the doctor said, which is true. It's a disdain for family life, a disdain for the beauty of a child and the wonder of a child and the gifts that a child brings to the family and to society and to all of us. And so what I'm seeing is, with the intrusion of our Western values into the developing world, is the same result. And that is an example would be in parts of the eastern part of Europe, where the imposing of these contraceptive mentality, abortion, and so forth, has fallen. What's happened is that, like in China, when so-called policies change, all right, and even though they haven't changed as drastically as people try to paint them, the reality is families still don't want children. The incentives, that you've seen in parts of Europe, we're going to pay you, give you an incentive, a tax write-off, or whatever it's going to be, has not really brought about the change that they thought it would be, because the mentality has crept in. I'm seeing the same thing in Africa, especially in the metro areas, in the major cities, where the universities and the media and the mindset, I give you an example of how this mentality creeps beyond the bedroom. Look at the developing, where development is happening in major cities. They're building buildings that only accommodate a very, very small family. And I give you an example that in parts of Central Europe, and also to Western Europe, and also in Asia. And I'm thinking of a couple of countries in mind, the Philippines, for example, that they're building brand new communities, and it's being very clearly stated that if you have more than 2 children, you cannot be in the community. You can't be here. So so you're watching a very strong influence of Western thought that's now becoming accepted. So I saw a comment from someone about Peru. Latin America, I mean, we're watching the welcoming of children, the numbers of children being brought into families is steadily decreasing. So it's everywhere. And the challenge before us is that we're fighting against, the WHO, you're fighting against the UN and all of its agencies, you're fighting against the foundations that at one time, for example, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Kennedy Foundation, and many of these were doing admirable work in education. And they were not so influenced by these ideologies, but now they've been overtaken, their boards are overtaken. And so you see all this money being pushed everywhere. And so the challenge is this is why it's important to do what we're all trying to do, is get underneath the issue and support the family, to support those values, to talk about the consequence of a contraceptive mentality and what does it do to the family, and not to make a child a commodity, not at all, but a child is and quote, is a great asset to a family on so many levels. And so especially in African cultures, in every culture, a child brings gifts and beauty and wonder. But like Dr. Jones says, what we're not considering is the fact that children die from a natural disease, an accident, the lack of health care and so forth. And so when we're encouraging these small families, we're not thinking about how does that impact the local community? How does it impact the local family in its own farm, in its own way of sustenance and subsistence? I mean, there's so many ways that this is influenced. So the reality is that I'm seeing, and that our staff is seeing around the world. And right now we're sitting in 116 countries. So we're watching this unfold in front of us, that this mentality is so intrusive and it's so corrosive. And so we really have to confront it. And that's what we're trying to do. And I know that's what Dr. Jones and others are doing through, so many of our programs. And so anyone out there that has other skills to bring, please let us know. We'll put you to work.
All right, I think we got time for 1 or 2 more questions. What are some practical ways that aid personnel can avoid falling back on doing things the way they're comfortable with, and instead learn to listen to local people?
Well, I think that's what you need to do, is to listen to local people, be willing to listen to local people. And I think go in with the idea, what we call epistemic humility, the idea that I could be wrong. What I think is best for you may not be what's best for you. And then use that as a starting point for developing a relationship of trust, where they know that I respect. I may not always agree with everything, all of your values. You may not necessarily agree with all of my values, but we respect the fact that we can discuss and work and maybe reach to some kind of a consensus about these values, and work within and build a relationship that respects the dignity of everybody involved, not only myself and the other leaders, but that recognizes the dignity of the people that we're going to be affecting by what the projects that we're bringing in.
Yeah, I definitely concur. I think it's walking in and respecting every individual and respecting them as human persons, and letting the conversation build, from that mutual respect and the desire for each other's good and well-being and flourishing. and understanding that, you know, because of for many reasons, especially as Catholics, you know, we approach things from our principles and an understanding of those principles, but not everybody that we encounter understands those principles, has ever been introduced to those principles, and doesn't work from that mindset. So, but they have their own principles and their own mindset, and it's listening to them, understanding them, and then finding a way to stretch the heart and mind to consider other possibilities. But that takes, and I agree, it takes relationship building and patient love and real solidarity. You know, that this is what I love about the Catholic Church in so many ways, is that when she enters into her charitable work, it's because it begins with response to a human need. And it doesn't matter what ethic, you know, what religious background they're from, or, you know, or religious belief. It's a human need. That's the first and immediate response. Then, and only then, after that immediate need has been dealt with, then the conversation, after building trust and relationships, you can then build the conversation and broaden your influence.
And, you know, and both sides have to recognize that people may not, one or the other may not always get what they want. When I worked with the clinic in Padibe, one of the things they want and still want is an X-ray machine. And I understand, you know, they have a lot of tuberculosis, and an X-ray machine would be good for that. But, you know, looking at assessing their needs from my perspective as a physician, I determined an ultrasound, a portable ultrasound, would be much more useful for them, you know, not because while it couldn't use it so much in terms of tuberculosis, they could use it for their maternity care. They could use it for, it's a better way of picking up other diseases, even pneumonias, than an X-ray. Gives them more insight in terms of the abdomen. And so they didn't get their X-ray, but they did get an ultrasound. But we worked together, and we also paid them for the training of that person. So they didn't get exactly what they wanted, but they, in a sense, they got what they needed.
I think we have time for one more. And you know, is there, you know, it's easy to get bogged down in these questions of, you know, paternalism and value and local culture and things like that. But is there, to actually have this conversation correctly, some kind of metaphysical discussion around, you know, how about expressing the reality of Catholic faith in the culture in a way that clearly distinguishes it as something intrinsically different and not just one of the many global ideologies that are competing for people's beliefs? I mean, is this a conversation, you know, that can't, you know, it seems like in principle, it's a conversation that can happen anywhere and should happen everywhere. Is this something that can or is, you know, happening on the ground in places that you're seeing?
So, I mean, I'll start in the sense of, you know, how to respond, you know, to a situation. Let's say that, you know, I mean, because we serve in countries that are not, the highest percentage is not a Catholic population, you know, in many of these places. So, but the way that, you know, I would suggest, the way that we've approached this is we walk in with that mindset and principles within ourselves, you know, and even though that's not the first thing on the table, we walk in with that Christian anthropological approach. We walk in with that metaphysical understanding of the human person. We walk in, you know, where there is a sense there are things that are just non-negotiable. I mean, we're not going to condone or advocate or advance anything that is contrary to those principles. And at the same time, it is about, you know, listening, entering the conversation to just listen to where the situation is, look at the immediate need, how to address that, and then begin to build on that conversation, on that particular situation. But it's important, at least I can only speak for myself and for HLI's approach, is we are a Catholic apostolate. we advance those Catholic principles, we advocate for those principles, and we try to do all that we can to help others to appreciate those principles and live by those principles, which are not just for Catholics. I mean, they're for all people, but it's not about imposing. It's about, in many cases, people don't understand. So an example like, and I'll say, and I'll toss it to Dr. Jones, is today I received an email from a program that we are working on for in India that's going to be in 2 weeks. And we're working with healthcare workers, and it's going to be a major program for them. We've done this many times. And so they were asking, what 2 documents should we do? Now, we're working with people who are Catholic, non-Catholic, and in many cases, non-Christian. And so what are we bringing? I have found, now, Philip, you'll appreciate this very much so. It's the ethical and religious directives that go with me and go with us, along with the document from the Pontifical Academy on healthcare workers. Now, the reason for that is they've never seen these in many cases. They don't have it in their local conference. They've never heard of them. But the principles that are in there are where you can start a conversation. Human dignity, human respect, the value of human life, the beauty of conjugal love, the importance of marriage. I mean, it starts the conversation. And so without imposing, there's an opportunity to discuss and then to be able how to approach. That's how I would suggest, and that's what we do.
Yeah, we're people that walk. I think as a Catholic Church, we're willing to journey with the people that we are helping, not to come in and for the greater good. We come in for the common good. And as long as we keep our eyes focused on that, the dignity of the person, the flourish, the allowing an environment for the flourishing of everyone, then we bring in something that's so much better than what any NGO can bring in, who is only concerned about the greater good and meeting their next bonus.